Our fellowship today is again in the Song of Love, the Song of Songs. It's the top song because two become one. When you see one, you see the other. Two loves become one. There's such a union here. And it's a progressive revelation of the two become one. And so, as the book goes on, as the song proceeds, it seems like we need to pursue to enter into every part of this song. Some lovers stop at chapter 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but here we are in chapter 6, which is a mature, loving bride in union with Christ for his pleasure, for his service. And am I here or am I not? Each one of us before the Lord needs to answer to him where we are before him. Well, the verse that we're covering today is chapter 6, verse 11, and it goes, "Or ever I was aware, my soul made me like the chariots of Ammi-nadib." The bride continues speaking. She was speaking in verse 11 of going down to the valley, the fruitful valley, and she speaks with one mind, one will, one interest, and having a thorough union with the beloved Christ. The loving bride with the beloved went down to the valley in verse 10. She was compared in the previous verses to light, different forms of light from heaven and as a triumphant army. So from the highest place, the highest depiction of who she was, she went down to the low valley, from the top to the bottom. But the thing is, when she went into the valley, something marvelous happened as she began to have increased revelations and visions, because she uses this word in verse 10. I went down, and then she says to see. She repeats that twice, to see, to see. In the valley, she began to have a new vision. We see things of Christ, and we see his interest, which can only be found when we're in the valley. This seeing many times is in the valley of suffering, as we suffer with Christ, or the hardships of life become so intense, and we have nothing or no one to turn to, and we open to our beloved Christ, we begin to see something differently of him. And also she sees him by going down. Her intention was to inspect. So she began to inspect the flourishing vine, and she began to inspect the budding pomegranates. So she's inspecting the movement or the growth of love and life in other seeking lovers of Christ. And this becomes her service. And this is a big way in our vision of Christ, and vision of what's on his heart, is when we begin to serve others. When we take our eyes from ourselves, when we take our eyes off of our personal growth. I mean, we don't stop seeking for our personal growth, but when we begin to focus on others, then, like she said, I went down to see. So she went in the valley taking care of others. Her vision increased. So this verse says, or ever I was aware. She uses the word I. Who is this I? Well, it's not the selfish I of introspection, or it's not the I that's caring only for her own spiritual progress or growth. In her perfection with the beloved, in union with him, she enters into his loving service for other seekers, and she enters into the fellowship of his suffering, as it says in Colossians 1, to produce and maintain increased growth for many other seeking lovers that bridal perfections could be seen in them. She says, or ever I was aware. As she contemplates the fruitful life in the valley, she forgot her elevated position of triumph, of heavenly shining. She could really actually not come to a certain knowledge of where she was. She says, or wherever where I was aware. It was like she was surprised, she was stunned where she was or where she was going. And Paul had this experience in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 3 and 4. He says he knew a man in the body or out of the body. He didn't know, but God knows that he was caught into paradise and heard unspeakable things which is not allowed for man to utter. So Paul had this kind of similar experience. So he was in chapter 6 writing the Song of Songs and his experience. Or in Revelation 21:10, the beginning of the verse, John had this experience when he says he was carried away in the Spirit. So she says, or ever I was aware. She's just surprised. It's an ecstasy that she's just bewildered. She's amazed. And you could say it's in three directions. Actually, it's with, she begins to realize the majesty in a deeper, fuller way, and the omniscience of her beloved Christ. Or what another surprise or bewilderment is, there's a sudden or a vehement desire of enjoyment of the spouse. Or you can say it's actually an ecstatic feeling of rapture of the bride and the bridegroom together. Or ever I was aware. There's just a sudden burst in her of joyous surprise. She's overwhelmed on one hand, but she's focused. His love, it says in Ephesians 3, surpasses knowledge. And he loves her and so many other lovers, seekers, with his poured out love, that just his love transforms. When you touch his love, his poured out love, and you abide in that love, you walk in that love, that love will transform you to match him for his pleasure. So she's so amazed with him and his love. His love has actually produced bridal features in her. She was just at one time just a maiden in a vineyard, but the contact with his burning love has produced bridal features in her, produced affections, bridal affections to match him in such a spousal union with him. She says, my soul made me. What is the soul? It's her entire person. It's her mind, her emotion, her will. This isn't just something outward. It's not just an outward excitement or an outward activity, but it's a love-bound heart. Her heart is just love-bound towards him. Her person actually was appointed. It was made for this union. He says, my soul made me. She was appointed or made for this union. Or you can say, I was made. My soul made me, or I was made. The loving activity of Christ is just stirring in her affection. She's just become so eager in her desire. She's swift in her movement towards him and his interest, and just to serve as he serves the new, young growth in the valley, the new, young seeking growth in the valley. Actually, she was selected, she was allotted for this loving union of life and love and service with him. And then she says, made me like. She uses the word like. There's a hymn that says, oh, to be like him, to match him. His inner working in you and me, actually he's working right now. His goal is to gain us inwardly, is to make us his spouse, that we can be the same as he is in his character, in his nature, and even in these verses, in his serving life and his service. It says she was like the chariots. It made me like the chariots of Ammi-nadib. The chariots here denote a movement. They denote motion. They denote action. So there's a longing of desire for Christ. The movement of Christ for his bride is toward her, and the bride is moving in love towards him. It's these chariots is as one riding a horse-drawn vehicle, which could be used either for warfare or for the travel of royalty. Actually, there's three places we can look to in the song, and these three places denote our movement with our beloved Christ, or our seeking desire. And maybe I just mentioned these three places, and you can see which one you're at, or maybe you still need to be before the Lord to find out. So these moving vehicles in chapter 1 verse 9, Jesus likened her to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. So she had the beauty and the strength of a horse, but it wasn't so spiritual. It was natural, but he appreciated it. And the problem was she was pulling Pharaoh's chariot. She was still pulling things of the world, but running after him. So this is the first moving vehicle, or chariot. And then in chapter 3 verse 9 it says Solomon's chariot was made of the wood of Lebanon. So there's a progress in her movement. She's become the chariot, or the actually used the word palanquin, to carry Solomon in his move and his procession. She'd become transformed, not only pulling the world, but the world was gone, and now she was carrying the beloved king. Now in this verse, in chapter 6 verse 12, she's become like chariots moving across the fields of the earth. She's loving advancing movement with Christ for his interest and his pleasure. No longer is she moving for her desire, but she's moving for his interest. She's entered into his service and moving in his interest. Chariots. Some consider these chariots as an attack of the enemy. And we should always be aware of the enemy, but it just doesn't seem like this fits in this verse. But I'm just going to let you know what some think. This is the forces of evil, the evil chariots trying to harm or distract her or defraud her from Christ and his service as her unique prize. She realized and was aware of the presence of the enemy, because she was just said she was terrible as an army with banners. But her movements towards Christ is what is depicted here in this verse. Some say she went down, and then in verse 10, and then when she went down, the chariots of the enemy attacked her. But it's not her going down was positive, and the chariots are positive. She's moving with Christ in his service. She's moving towards Christ. She's consecrated in service, and she's entering into his heart, his interest, his pleasure. The chariots were of Ammi-nadib. Ammi-nadib is literally this word, this place, or it could be a person. Some say it was a person, a well-known charioteer. He was famous for his speed. But I'm going to break down this word, and it literally means my people, a noble one, or a willing people. Now she's among the princely and virtuous people who have freely chosen to move, to sacrifice themselves for the king. So she went to the garden, she went down, but now she finds her, she went to to see what was flourishing, the flourishing vine and the budding pomegranates. But now what happens? She's among the willing people. So the growth, the freshness of growth is actually the willing people. She supports the move of God wherever there is fresh new growth of loving seekers. And she's entered into the royal move of the King for his increase of the kingdom and his glory. Her union with his service brings her into the royal movements of his people. It's amazing. She went down, but actually she went up. She's so surprised at how she's been elevated with royal dignity and glory as she entered into the valley of service of many lovers, but she's brought to the heights of royalty. Isn't this amazing? Many times we give ourselves to serve, and maybe it's insignificant, but the Lord has led us there, and we're there among the needy ones, or the ones that are new, and we begin to serve. We begin to serve them with the truth. We serve them with encouragement. We serve them by watering them, helping them to learn to pray, to read the Word of God, to preach the gospel, even to serve themselves, how to be with other believers. And as we serve them and we see the growth happening in their lives, it seems like we're elevated to royalty, because when we see the willingness of God's people to grow, we're taken up. This is like the verse in Matthew chapter 23 verse 12. It says, when you humble yourself, you'll be exalted. Ammi-nadib can be referred to in Psalm 110 verse 3. It says, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power, in holy splendor. These willing people, which is the literal way of this name, Ammi-nadib, actually it's not their natural will, or it's not merely their human strength or their human wisdom or their human talent, but it's those who have been captured by Christ. A person that is captured by Christ becomes willing, subdued by his beauty, and obedient in consecration to him. They become willing. They become a princely people. They're changed like Jacob was, from a Jacob to a princely Israel. Actually, a willing heart becomes a chariot for his movement. When we resist him, or when we're stubborn towards him, actually this gives him no freedom to move as he would like to do. You read in Exodus 35, all the people were there, and they were offering themselves and all their possessions, the gold and the silver and the different materials, willingly to the Lord. And then therefore this kind of willingness to offer themselves and all they had gave the Lord ground to build the tabernacle, his dwelling place, and this gave him a way for his move, and gave him a way to have a testimony on earth. When you remember there was another time in Matthew 26:41 in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus told his sleeping disciples that the spirit is willing. It's not the flesh, but the spirit is willing. So our regenerated spirit is the place where our union with Christ, it's willing. There's a place in our being that is regenerated, born again, and it's willing to love him. It's willing to follow him. It's willing to give all to him. It's willing for his interest and his desire. So the chariots of Ammi-nadib, these are the willing, generous, noble lovers that move for the beloved's interest and for his pleasure. And so the bride is doing service among these willing people for the king, and she's entered into the move of the willing people. She's like a chariot. The bride goes down to the valley to serve and care for others, and then she realizes the royalty of the people of God who gave themselves willingly to him. So there's a couple questions I need to ask myself. Am I in the move of God today among his willing people of royalty? What about people around us? Some are beginning to seek the Lord, and do I encourage them? Am I one with the Lord's working in them? The vehicle for him to travel on earth today is actually our absolute consecration to him. His move corresponds with our willingness. Am I holding back? I need to ask myself, am I providing a vehicle? Am I a vehicle for him to move on the earth? He's going to move on the earth, but Lord, make me that vehicle that you can move through freely. You know, it's really a time of declension, a time of degradation, and he needs those that match him in affection, and match him in beauty and character and loving service. He needs those that are absolutely consecrated and willing. When he says go, do I resist? When he says pray, do I pray? When he says care for the suffering and needy, do I? A willing heart provides a way for him to carry out his will on the earth today. May the Lord's mercy gain us, that we would match him in his beauty and also match him to be willing to serve him and to serve others for his heart's desire.